Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of SuperCoach, mates. Well, we're nearing the halfway mark of our season review or season wash-up for all 18 clubs. So today we're going to go through the Western Bulldogs, Melbourne and Richmond and their wash-ups for the year. So as per normal, I am joined by Thomas. How are you going, Thomas?
Yeah, not too bad. Pretty slow week on the trade table. It seems like majority of these deals will get done in literally the last minute on the Friday arvo. Seems like a lot of teams are holding out and trying to potentially get overs for what the players are worth, but definitely interesting. A lot of since we recorded last week with the Pies and the Blues, the Crows and Port, sorry. Seems like really the only trades have been facilitated at the draft picks, which is definitely interesting, which I have a feeling that means there could be some big names that have been thrown around in the coming days, that's for sure. But as Nathan said, we're about to go through three pretty disappointing teams, I'd say, especially if you're supporting either of these teams. I'd be pretty keen to hear what you probably have to say, which you can leave in the comments. But also, I think you'd be pretty disappointed with how your team went if it's one of these three. But kicking things off, as Nath said, we're going to start off with the Tigs. Season ravaged by injury. They came last. I mean, I think it's a bit of a mass exodus at the moment with the Tigers. It's a bit of an unfortunate situation where they're at, really. Adam Hughes really probably didn't deserve what he copped with the amount of injuries, the amount of players that are leaving at the moment. Best result was surprisingly a 5-point win versus Sydney. I believe that was round 3.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, really an impressive win. I guess Sydney just aren't the best at the G, as we saw in the grand final. But yeah, gave him an E, probably avoided the F simply because of the amount of injuries they had this season. I think they're the most in the AFL. But looking at their list, if you remove all those players that are going to be traded in the next upcoming days, doesn't fill, I don't think, myself with much confidence. What's your thoughts, Nathan, on their season quickly?
Yeah, exactly the same. I think they probably didn't deserve the F just because of the fact that they lost so many players to injury. But as I said, that Sydney win, I will put a question mark on that Sydney Sydney win, because that was the week where all that Sam Wick stuff broke out at Sydney, and I think they were a little bit mentally off that week. Which again, not taking anything away from Richmond. But yeah, there was that factor in there. But yeah, I think Richmond, unfortunately for Tigers fans, I think you're going to have to get used to this for a few years. You know, you've had your 3 premierships in 4 years, which is fantastic. Probably more than definitely what I thought at the end of 17. I didn't think they'd win another 2 after that. I thought they might win 1. But to get another 2, I feel like, you've got to ride the highs with the lows. So they're in a bit of a low patch at the minute. So, unfortunately, I think they're in for a rough few years. But again, they could surprise everyone. But yeah, I think just looking at their list at first glance, it does seem like they're a little bit, perhaps going to be down the bottom for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. When I was putting this together, I think it was definitely concerning with the amount of players that are leaving and what that kind of leaves with regards to players that are remaining on that list and what star players. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the Richmond review to see where they're at as a club. But moving on to your stats, Nathan, I'm interested to see what you see from the Tigers from your stats that matter, but I can probably assume that there's not much pre-reading out there.
Well, the Richmond one's actually the easiest one because they're bottom 6 in every stat that I've been tracking. So I think that was always going to be the case. I think coming into this season, I didn't really have high expectations of Richmond, because generally what happens is once you lose someone that's a marquee figure, they like Hardwick, you do have a dip here. I wasn't really surprised that they finished, in the bottom sort of, in the bottom half of the, on the bottom of the ladder. But in terms of, their stats, as I said, they're basically bottom 2, bottom 3 in everything, which is probably not where you really want to be. But So their clearance game wasn't too it was still bottom 6, but it wasn't bottom 3. So they've got that, I guess, to take away from the year, that their overall clearance differential was still in the negative, but it wasn't bottom 3 worthy. But yeah, basically every other every other stat I've got here, they were 17th in scores from turnover. They scored the They scored the second fewest points from turnover. They gave up the second most points from turnover. They scored the least from the back half. They conceded that is equal second most from back half. So yeah, unfortunately for Tigers, it's not pretty reading. But as I said, I think it's more about I'm almost willing to throw these out for Richmond, just because of sort of where they're at. I don't know if you're going to get a really good, I guess for Richmond supporters, you'd probably be wanting to see just, an overall improvement, even if it's, not the middle band or probably the top 6 band. I don't think it's realistic, but I feel like that this could be, as far back as they go, even if the list might say otherwise. But if they can start pushing their way up into a few yellows with some of these stats, even if it's like 12th or 11th, next year, I would say that's probably a win. Just going off a raw thing, I guess for me, the thing I'm looking at Richmond next year away from this is just percentage. Just an incremental increase in percentage every year will give me hope that what they've done is the right thing, because generally, as I said, when you're dealing with the bottom side, you generally don't look at this stuff because it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be bottom 6. So for me next year, I'm just purely looking at percentage for Richmond and just seeing whether or not it increases and by how much. I think that's going to be the better guide on Richmond.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. I've got the list up on another screen here at the moment with their playing list. You look at the likes of, Prestige, just more so reeling off their kind of top tier list. It's not pretty reading, but you got Vloston, Prestia, Rioli, Taranto, Short, Gibcus if fit, Lynch if fit, Bolter, Jacob Hopper, McIntosh, Graham's out, so he's gone. And that's really about it. So scrolling down, there's not too many top listers, so it's going to be really important that their young core step up big. That's the biggest thing.
If I can just butt in, I just had a look. Their percentage was 63.7. So I don't know if I'm going to do preview shows, but if I'm a Richmond supporter, I'd be wanting to see that probably mid to high 70s next year. Yeah. And then you probably start thinking about the 90s, and then you get back into the hundreds, and then you're probably winning more games than you are. So I feel like if that's the way that Richmond are going to go, I feel like that's probably the best thing for Richmond is if they can get their percentage sort of up into the 70s. I would say that's probably a bigger win than perhaps, them winning more games. They might go backwards, but if their percentage is still actually going up, I still feel like that's a win.
Yeah, no, for sure. But moving on to their trades and ins and outs, we've kind of removed top fives majority of these teams based on the fact that as the trades keep rolling on, there's probably not as much speculation going into each team. But yeah, majority for the Tigs is the fact that the amount of outs they're probably going to have this season. Graham's obviously off that list. I haven't included him. I just forgot to include him. But yeah, Liam Baker, Dan Rioli, Shai Bolton are the 3 other names on top of Graham that are potentially going to be out by the end of the week. You look at the ends, they're not really targeting anyone in particular. It seems like they're looking at how many top 10 draft picks they could squeeze in. What are your thoughts on that method, Nathan? Do you think it's kind of the right idea to go draft heavy, especially in a year that's stacked with talent? Or do you reckon because I've just, named 8 players that are really their top echelon coming into 2025 with the amount of retirements and trade outs, it seems like, do you reckon the Tigers have kind of missed a beat with potentially bringing in, bona fide premium talent for these players? Or do you reckon the draft's the way to go this season?
No, I think the draft's the way to go this year. You still need experience there because they need to be there to guide the young players there. We see with North Melbourne, that they basically had a mass exodus of experience and they haven't been able to recover. This is, I guess, the only, risk in going down this really draft-heavy path is that you basically have a generation of players who don't get really success, like unfortunately what's happened at North Melbourne. But in saying that, from what I've read about this draft and from what all the draft, experts are telling me, it is a really, really deep draft.
Yep.
So if you are going to go down that really heavy draft intensive path, it probably is going to be this one, just given the fact that it is quite heavy. Just on those, so I think I'll come back to Liam Baker. So I think there's still one pick 6 for Rioli, which I think will form part of that trade with Gold Coast. Even though I think it's slightly overs probably what he's worth. He's probably only worth I think he's probably only worth about a mid first round pick, but then you factor in he's the best and fairest winner and he's still in contract as well. So you always got to pay overs to do that. So I think at the end of the day, I think pick 6 is probably reasonable, just given the fact that the best and fairest is in contract as well. The Liam Baker one's interesting. So all trade period, I've heard that they're going to use pick 13 for Liam Baker. Well, or they're going to, West Coast are going to get pick 13 from Hawthorn and then they're going to give it to Richmond for Baker. Well, Hawthorn sort of threw that spanner in the works when they decided to do the pick swap with, was it Carlton? Yeah, to remove that pick 14 or pick 13, sorry. So I don't know now what happens with this Baker deal. I still feel like it'll get done, but there's going to have to be a little bit of wiggling around to get that done. And as for Shea Bolton, well, I don't know what Fremantle are, I guess, willing to pay for him. I think that's where he wants to go. I think he's picked Freo over West Coast. You might be able to correct me there if I'm wrong, Thomas.
No, I believe it is Freo.
So, where do you see Bolton? Do you see him as a sort of an early, maybe not an early, but maybe a sort of like around the high teens, low teens? Where do you sort of see Bolton rate? Because I sort of see him in that, again, probably around that Rioli mark. He's sort of probably a bit better than the second round pick, but he's probably in that mid sort of range as well. But then I think he's in contract as well. He's got X factor, so again, you probably got to pay overs for him. So, realistically, where do you see him? So, if you think Rioli's 6, where do you think Bolton is? Probably about 10, 8, 6 to 10.
I did have a chat about this to work with a mate at work who's a colleague at work. Sorry, he's a Collingwood supporter, but it's interesting because Rioli at pick 6 or what they're getting for him, I think personally is overs. Potentially, just because of what Rioli wasn't a bona fide All-Australian halfback or anything. He was kind of transformed into that role, similar to how Battle was, a very hit and miss forward, back, whatever we had during Ross Lyon, basically took the reins on him. So it's a bit skewed in that regard. Bolton, I think, in my opinion, he struggled a little bit towards the back end of Richmond just because I don't think he had the support around him. I think someone like Freo could definitely help him with the likes of Brayshaw, Sarong. You got Switkowski in there. You got a lot of...
Walters is still going around.
Got Jackson dominating that ruck line and forward line.
Tracy.
Yeah, Tracy. So I would say... Look, if you're paying top 6 picks for Rioli, maybe early teens for Bolton. I think Bolton's a bit more hit and miss than Rioli. Rioli probably a bit more consistent if he sticks in that role, if he does stay in that role, or whatever Dimmer Hardwick wants to do with him. But yeah, I'd say probably early teens for Bolton. But it'd be interesting to see what they get Richmond, because I think they really need to solidify their draft hand, especially if they're losing Baker, Rioli, Bolton, Graham, basically top 4 players in their team. You really want to get in as much top 10 draft talent as possible, I think.
So is it just a case of Richmond saying, or is it just a case of Freo saying, well, we'll give you a top 15 pick? Do Richmond just take that?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if they maybe if I was their list manager, maybe push to get a player across from Freo. I don't know how that would work with regards to any uncontracted players or anything like that, but I'd play hardball with Bolton. I think he's capable of being top 5, 10 in the competition with his talent. I think you got to play hard with him, because if you lose out on him, he's a big loss, because we know, and I've watched him multiple times against St Kilda in particular, where he's torn us a new one. And then the last thing Richmond supporters want to see, he goes over to Freo or in WA in general and just dominates on Optus Stadium. So, yeah, definitely one to watch in the upcoming days. But as we move on to our player focus, it's not always going to be a young player coming through. It's team dependent. But, yeah, Tim Taranto's the pick of the bunch. I think he's going to have to play a pretty crucial role come 2025. He's obviously Nankervis is captain at the moment. I don't think he needs to step up into that position, but just a leadership role and really step into them, basically be their number one midfielder and really lead that brigade. Best game, in my opinion, was 139 SuperCoach points versus the Hawks. That was round 14, 33 disposals, 5 tackles, 8 clearances. I think the biggest problem with Taranto was his fitness. I think he was injured for the majority of the season. He averaged about 94 SuperCoach points when fit. Do you reckon he can be the number one Tiger come 2025, or do you reckon there's just so much doubt in his body that you can't really, trust Taranto to lead that midfield charge?
Yeah, so he played 15 games. He did average 94.5. So well done on that. Look, I think he probably does need to be Richmond's best player next year, especially with this mass exodus. But in terms of SuperCoach, unless he's a forward, he's probably going to be an avoid, just because I think there's probably better options that are more reliable, more consistent at that price. But yeah, I hope for his sake that he can prove Kane Corns wrong, and actually, become the player that Richmond, paid all those draft picks for, and offered the long-term contract for. I hope he can become that player, because I think they're the type of players who Richmond are going to need to, I guess, keep them relevant and then bring them out of this period and, elevate them back up into the top 8. So, yeah, I feel like if Taranto can become, I guess, their marquee player, that'll go a long way for Richmond helping out. There's no Martin there, obviously, anymore. So it is going to be up to Taranto, Hopper, Prestia, these guys to, get themselves on the park, but then stay on the park and impact as well. So, he's got all the attributes to be a good player. I think the knock on him has always been his kicking, Taranto. Yeah. Which if he can fix that up, I think he can go a long way. But yeah, just purely from SuperCoach, I wouldn't be going anywhere near him in Classic. I'd maybe have a little nibble in Draft, but even then, I think there's probably better options than Taranto. But I guess sometimes with Draft, you just got to pick a warm body. And if he can become a warm body that's, consistent and reliable, some people might look at him as perhaps a bit of a left field option. But I think in Classic, unless he's a forward, there's probably better options. I think myself. Are you along the same lines?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think, unless he's a forward definitely changes that conversation. But, injury risk is a massive problem. And I think, you're probably going to look at a similar vein to North Melbourne, where your best players are going to come in games where they get absolutely pumped regardless. And I think when they get pumped, the ball just doesn't get in the hands of their best users. And that's the biggest problem, I think, when it comes to picking those kind of line ball midfielders. But yeah, he's definitely one to watch next if he does get DPP for whatever reason. But moving on to the Dees, really disappointing here. They've got serious off-field issues, I think, that need to be addressed sooner rather than later. You got likes of Petrarca, Oliver wanting to probably leave. As much as the Dees say otherwise, I think there's problems left, right, centre with these lot. They finished 14th, which I think as a club you'd be super disappointed with, regardless of how close they were at times to making finals and whatnot. I think 14th is a disaster for them. Probably avoided that F just because of some early season good form and the potential of making finals, and they've just kind of crumbled to a heap with so many off-field issues. I think if you remove all those off-field issues away from the D's, they probably make finals. But I think, Simon Goodwin's got a lot on his hands and a lot of pressure coming into 2025. The best result was a 7-point win versus Port Adelaide, I think, and a really gritty win at the G. What's your quick summation of their season?
Yeah, I think you've summed it up well. Just off-field issues, cultural issues. Unfortunately, just took their toll, I suppose. But yeah, there are a few damning stats that I'll go through the sec. But yeah, just a first glance. Yeah, a lot of off-field issues. The Petrarca issue didn't help Oliver. I don't know if Oliver's ever going to get back to his best at Melbourne. Which I don't know if we're going to talk about him, but I might have a controversial view, perhaps. But we'll see about that. But yeah, I guess with Melbourne, yeah, I didn't have them making the 8, but I didn't have them finishing 14th. I sort of had them around sort of where Collingwood finished, around that sort of, the 10 to 11 mark around there. So to finish 14th is, a real disappointment. But I guess finishing 14th, it does mean that they will have an easier draw next year. So if they rebound, I think they can rebound quite quickly if they can fix this off-field stuff, just because of that draw. They're probably going to dodge a lot of the top 6 sides from this year twice. They might get, one or two, but in terms of their fixture, they're probably going to get sides like Richmond and North Melbourne and sides that probably, at least on paper, we don't think are going to be there next year. So I guess that's the upside of Melbourne finishing 14th. But yeah, they need to obviously work on their culture before anything else.
Yeah, I think the cultural thing is the biggest thing. On field, I think they've got the talent there for sure. But moving on to your stats, Matt, it'd be interesting to see what you say about the Dees, because I think from the eye test, they have one of the most dynamic midfielders or midfield group going around, with Gawn in the ruck, who's still a dominant ruckman. I think will be still one until he retires. You look at Oliver and Petrarca. Granted, they didn't have the years they wanted to, but if they're at their best, they're firing. And arguably one of the better defensive combos in Lever and May, but it just seemed like it crashed completely apart for them as the season went on. Is that reflective in the stats, and how do they stack up against the 8?
Yeah, well, I'll start. So Melbourne went away from who they were this year. So they wanted to become this high transition team who moved the ball, looked really flashy, and that's not who Melbourne are. Melbourne aren't that team. So you go back to 2023 and you have a look. They were the number 1 contested possession side. They were top 6 for clearance. They had the most inside 50s of any club They had the most inside 50s of any club. Their turnover game was top 3. They gave up the least points basically defensively, I think, across the whole year. Maybe they were second fewest. And then you flip to this year, and basically their whole profile just completely evaporated. So you talk about that, I guess, the Max Gawn impact, but they were bottom 6 for just raw clearance differential this year. They were bottom 6 for inside 50, so they couldn't win it at the source. Then they couldn't get territory. And then because they couldn't get territory and their clearance game wasn't working, then their turnover game fell away. That fell into the bottom 6. They were 15th in the turnover game. Which last year they were 3rd. So that's actually the biggest drop-off of any team, from 3rd down to 15th. But then they just couldn't score as a result. So it sort of started correcting towards the second half of the year. They sort of started going a bit back to who they were. But I guess this is the risk in changing who you are on the go, is that I don't know why they went away from it, because if you go back over those finals games last year, so the Collingwood game and the Carlton game, if they kick accurately, they probably beat Collingwood on that night. And that was one of those, I guess, it wasn't an outlier, but it was a really odd night in that, Melbourne had 69 inside 50s, but they only scored 53 points. So it's not often that you don't score. It's not often that you scored that little with 69 inside 50s. So inaccuracy hurt them. And then even in the other game against Carlton, They scored 4 goals, 13 from turnover that night. And again, they won the inside 50 battles. So I don't really know why they went away from who they were, because it didn't. That wasn't the issue. The issue was their conversion in front of goal. But then because they went away from who they were, I think they were sort of a bit mix and match between two different styles. And they highlighted this throughout the year when there were times where they looked for the they looked for the hand. They looked for the handball, or the handball was on, but they didn't take it. So then they went. So then they went long down the line. But then there were other times where they did take the handball on, and it sort of got them into a bit of trouble. So I feel like it's easier than for Melbourne to just go back to who they were, which was the strong contested beasts in the midfield, high inside 50s, and get it on the scoreboard. But I don't know if that's going to work anymore, because we've seen Collingwood go with this more efficient model with lower inside 50s. Brisbane were a high inside 50 team, but they were also quite efficient. So I feel like that's the area that Melbourne need to fix the most, is their efficiency going forward. Because if they can get back their 2023 form, well, they're probably finishing top 4 again next year, and with an easier draw and a bit of a reset of their culture, if they choose to go down that path, I wouldn't be surprised if they push right back up. But again, it's got to be cultural, and it's got to be the game style that suits the players. So I feel like if they can do 2023 again next year, then they're probably in the top 4. They're probably, top 2 defensively, like they have been for like the last 3 or 4 years. And yeah, so that's sort of my recap on Melbourne, is I guess don't change who you are and just stick with who you are, because if you go changing things, especially like that, when you had a model that worked and it just needed refining, to completely flip that and become a side you weren't, I guess it probably showed this year. So that might be a lesson for all clubs, is to just stick with who you are and just work with what you've got, and just tinker as you go.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think they had that winning model, and you just have to look at back in 2021 when they won that premiership, albeit a COVID year. But if they can get their centre clearance work ahead of the ball, and especially inside 50, I think that's going to go a long way in fixing a lot of.
And their 2021 season, they were great in that. They won all 3 contested possession battles. They won one of the clearance battles, which was obviously the grand final. They won the inside 50 battle in the finals. They won the scores from turnover battle in finals. So the way they played was a finals type game. That's why they did so well in finals.
Yeah.
Also, that's why they did so well throughout the year, because the way they played was made for finals. But it was just their own inaccuracy that cost them, which I feel like can just fluctuate from game to game. Which is why I was really surprised when they came out with this different model, because that's all I thought they go to. But yeah, that's my stats wrap on Melbourne.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. But yeah, looking at their trade in the ins and outs, their big ones, Clary Oliver requested a trade out to Geelong. Seems like the deal is a long way to go with regards to potentially getting it done. Neil Bullen's a confirmed out with regards to his move to South Australia, move back home. I think it's kind of a win-win with regards to that trade. The Dees get that second round pick, and and Neil Bullen gets to go home and probably plays an important role with regards to Crows. Harry Sharp is a potential interesting in for the Dees. From the Lions, I think he's pretty highly regarded within the Lions group, albeit didn't play in that premiership winning side, but he definitely showed potential with getting into the best 22, but also making some impact when he was in that group. Tommy Campbell, my old mate from St Kilda, Blake probably is about close to retirement age, but still gets 1-year contracts left, right, centre. It's interesting what your thoughts on this is, Nathan, considering they went down that Grundy route already. Didn't go quite to plan with that, playing the dual ruck. He seems like he's almost back up. He's very highly regarded from what I've heard St Kilda internally for leadership, development of young ruck craft as well. Could be super important for their culture. I think it's a big reason why they got him. But I think the biggest one that everyone wants to hear about is Clayton Oliver, and what's your thoughts and what's your controversial opinion on Oliver, Nath?
Yeah, well, we'll start off with that, and I think Melbourne should trade Clayton Oliver. I think if you're going to come out and say that your coach is the best in the AFL, and then 12 months later we're having the same conversation, he's still got off-field issues. I just think that that 7-year contract that Melbourne gave him is just going to haunt them. So I feel like if Geelong give Melbourne a second round, or maybe not a second round pick, maybe if Geelong come to Melbourne and say we'll give you pick 17 and maybe a future second, if I'm Melbourne and you want to set standards for your culture, I'd be just taking that, just move him on, being a great player for the club, but the club's always bigger than the player. And sometimes with these types of players, you just have to say thanks for what you've done, but we need a reset. A bit like what Collingwood did with Grundy and Treloar and those when they had those salary cap issues. So that's I guess my controversial opinion is that if I'm Melbourne, I'm actually looking actively to shop him around, just to get rid of him. Even if you've got to pay the majority of his salary, I still think that you've got to set your club up culturally really well to succeed. And this year it sort of fell in a heap. So I guess if Melbourne hold him, it's up to Oliver to show that he's improved, which by all reports he has, and good on him. But yeah, if you're going to come out and say that your culture's the best and then it falls in a heap, well, something's gone amiss there. So if he is a problem and he's been identified as a problem, then I feel like sometimes it's just better to cut your losses and just move him on and just get rid of that, I guess, toxic, that sort of thing, and just have a complete reset there. As for Neil Bullen, very underrated player. I feel like his loss might hurt Melbourne more than what people realise. So obviously a good pickup for Adelaide. I know he wanted to go home. He was a bit homesick, which is fair enough. It does happen. So yeah, I feel like Adelaide have got a ready-made player, and he can sort of play that hybrid role, that sort of that mid-forward role. I know he tagged Nick Dacos on King's birthday, which I think surprised some people. But then you actually look at it and you go, well, he's probably the only player who's got the engine to go with Nick Dacos. So Adelaide have always sort of struggled against Collingwood recently, and one of the reasons has been Nick Dacos. So I don't think this had anything to do with it. But if they can quell Nick Dacos with Neil Bullen, I think that'll go a long way for Adelaide. Finally beating Collingwood for the first time in a while. Tom Campbell, yeah, this is an interesting one. I have to say I don't know much about Tom Campbell. You might be able to do that better than what I can, Thomas. But from what I've heard, he is a bit of a lumbering ruckman, which doesn't really, I guess, suit them. So unless he's playing as a forward, they can go in the ruck, a bit like Jackson or Mason Cox at Collingwood, where they sort of play forward, but they can go in the ruck, or like Joe Danaher. I don't really see a purpose for him, because I don't know why you go out of your way to get a VFL player and pay him. And Harry Sharp, I still think that deal will get done. I don't know what he's worth. Is he worth a late first round, early second rounder? But I still feel like that deal will get done, which I don't know much about Harry Sharp. I think is he a Freo?
No, he's at the Lions.
He's at Brisbane. Okay, so I know who he is now. So obviously it didn't get much opportunity at Brisbane. So I don't know if that dilutes his value. I think he's still quite young, so that might sort of balance it out a bit. So I don't know if you're Melbourne, what do you pay? You're paying a second round, a third round pick, but Yeah, I just feel like that for Melbourne, the bigger thing that Melbourne need is a cultural reset as opposed to players coming in and out.
Yeah,
So they need the right players coming in, and then they need the players who they've identified as perhaps causing some issues moving
yeah.
on, and just having a complete reset. Because I still think the list is quite good, but obviously, yeah, they've underperformed, and then obviously all this cultural stuff, and Kate Roffey leaving, and whether or not there's going to be an external review, and then there isn't an external review, and then there is an external review. So there's all a lot of stuff going on there. Yeah, so that's my thoughts. Perhaps it's controversial, but I just think in Melbourne's best interests, if they get a reasonable offer for Oliver from Geelong, which I said is probably a first rounder and maybe a second rounder or a future second rounder, I'm probably taking that and just setting the standards that we're not going to tolerate this anymore.
Yeah, no, I think they've really got to put a line in the sand really to stamp out any issues with culture. Tommy Campbell, I think, is more of a depth thing than anything. If Gawn does go down long-term injury, they've got someone there as a better replacement than like a Shaki or some real dodgy ruck replacement. But I think the big reason why they brought him in, and my gut feeling, is a cultural thing. Like, he was really highly regarded as a really respected leader in St Kilda internally speaking. From a developmental point of view, he won the BNF for the Sandy Zebs, and just showed that he's able to be still around the AFL four walls and really put in some input or significant input when it comes to developing young ruckmen in particular. But moving on to our player focus, this one's an interesting one. I think he's one definitely to watch out SuperCoach wise, especially if he keeps his DPP status in defence, or I don't know if he was DPP, maybe it was just defence last year, but if he does keep his defensive eligibility, is one to watch out for. Trent Rivers, and the reason I say this, and I'll get your opinion on this, Nath, is his ability to play midfield. As soon as Oliver and Petrarca went down injured, slash, whatever Oliver had and not playing, he came into the fray and actually did really well in the games he played in the midfield. They utilised his kicking quite effectively. Played off halfback previously, wasn't really that relevant, but as soon as he stepped into the mids, he definitely showed, similar to like a Hayden Young, where he was able to push forward with aggressive kicking from the back line and move forward that way. 143 versus the Eagles. Definitely showed his ability to score highly against a weaker opposition. Round 17, 29 disposals, 5 tackles, 7 clearances. What are your opinion, Nathan, on can he consolidate himself in the mids? Obviously, it's a question dependent on if Oliver and Petrarca stay in the mids, but what's your thoughts on him playing midfield in 2025, and does that make him more relevant, especially if he stays in defensive eligibility?
Yeah, so I will just cut in there. We do have some breaking news from Tom Morris, who has suggested that the Houston deal to Collingwood is perhaps happening sooner than what we think. So if that's the case, that's good news for Collingwood and Port Adelaide and Gold Coast, who will all probably sort of get what they need to and whatnot. But yes, moving back to Trent Rivers. So he sort of started moving into the midfield last year, which probably went unnoticed. But then this year, he sort of really, I guess, became really more of a centre bounce player. But his raw numbers are actually quite good for a centre bounce player. But yeah, I guess there's always that question of when you've got Petrarca and Viney. Although I think Oliver will still be there next year, so I will put the caveat on that. So I guess that's going to be the one problem on Rivers is I just don't know if he's going to be in the mid. I don't know if he's the type of player who can start at halfback and then come into the midfield for first rotation and they shift someone else to halfback line and work it that way. I don't know if that's something you really want to tinker with because I feel like that when he's in there, he actually does have an impact. And yeah, he's only going to get older. So I feel like if there was one thing that Melbourne actually did do quite well this year was they did have a look at a lot of different mixes. with players coming in and out of different positions and roles and whatnot. And yeah, as I said, Trent Rivers was one they identified last year's going in there, and his impact in there was really good. And this year, I don't have the raw numbers in front of me, but it looked like the eye test said he was doing quite well as a midfielder. So yeah, I feel like that perhaps more time for him in the midfield is the way forward. And if they get rid of Oliver, which I hope they do, I don't think they will. But then I think he just slots in and becomes a full-time midfielder. But yeah, if Oliver's still there, I feel like he has to get himself in there because I feel like he's too good not to be in there now. So just for SuperCoach, again, probably like Taranto, unless he's defensive eligible, I think there's probably better options than him. And the same with draft as well. I'd probably have a nibble at him, but I still feel like there's probably better options. But again, if he still remains as a defender eligible, which I don't think he will, I think he only played about 25% of the season in the back line. I think you need to play 35 or above to be DPP eligible. So I don't think he's going to have that next year. So perhaps it's going to be a pass for me on Trent. But again, if he is DPP eligible, and depending on what Melbourne's draw looks like and what he's priced at, he might be worth a bit of a POD look at the start of the year. But yeah, at this stage, it's a no for me for Rivers.
Yeah, I think he's a big preseason watch. It really depends on what the trades look like moving forward. But I guess if Oliver does leave, that opens up a massive hole to fill. And I think Rivers plays a big part in that moving forward. But we've left arguably the best to last, Nath, because I think you're going to rip into this one. And I know it's been revving up for about a whole week to rip into the Dogs. I've given them a C plus just purely based on the fact they made finals. I think any chance or any other year where they miss out on finals with the season these guys had, I think would be almost a fail. 2024 ladder position 6, so not too bad with regards to the overall perspective of pure ladder position. They obviously lost to the Hawks in the elimination final in a real disappointing manner. Just really didn't look like to get going. I think it was a season where they beat the teams they should, and the teams they were expected to lose, they did lose. They were really in at crossroads, I think, and bit of a confusing season, I think, if you were the Dog supporter. You look at mid-year through the year, Luke Beveridge was close to being sacked, and then he managed to turn their year around to play finals, and all of a sudden he's the next, second coming of God to save that season, and then look and get absolutely dominated. They were touted to be a team that were going to make grand final aspirations with how dominant they looked in that last month of footy. But what are your thoughts on, before you move into the underlying stats, which are, from what I've heard off camera, a bit damning for the Dogs? What's your kind of quick summation of the Dogs 2024 season?
Yeah, well, same old for the Dogs. They basically beat who they weren't expected to beat, and then they lost to the games that they should have beaten, that they should have won. So I guess, unfortunately, once you do it over a number of years, it's not an outlier, it's a trend. So this is a trend that they need to fix. Because once we get into a minute, I know Thomas has been looking forward to this. When I told him I'd done all this and this was the one team that I flagged. I think C plus is very generous myself. I just don't know. Again, I've got the underlying numbers, but I just don't know how you can have this list and not win a final before even looking at the stats. So that's for me. That's why I think C plus is very generous. I'd probably give them an E, to be honest. I think their year was just as poor as Richmond's at the end of it. But yeah, it baffles me how the Western Bulldogs can have probably arguably the best list on paper, which is the eye test, and then they don't win a final. So it's baffling to me. But anyway, that's the Dogs. So if they're happy with that, well, good on them. But I can guarantee you now, if I was a Dogs supporter, I'd be pretty frustrated.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I think it's a definitely frustrating year and a season of missed opportunities, that's for sure. But this is all what I've been waiting for. Is if I get this here slide, stats that matter, Nath. You look at them on the eye test. They come sixth. You go, hey, similar to what St Kilda went through back in the COVID year. You come sixth year. Well, St Kilda's case, we won a final. Dogs, we lose a final. But yeah, they made finals, which is the most important thing, I think, as a supporter looking, at the outset of it all, not looking too deep. But are there more problems than we first thought of looking into this season? Because as you said, these stats don't look that amazing.
Well, the stats do look amazing because they're basically top 6 in every single stat, which is even more baffling as to how they didn't actually win a final. So they actually had a better profile this year than Brisbane, who we just saw won the grand final by 10 goals. And they actually had a better statistical profile than what Brisbane did. They were number 1 for inside 50 differential. They were top 6 for contested possessions, top 6 for clearances. They scored the most points from stoppage. Again, not really that relevant scores from stoppage, but they did score the most points. They were top 6 in scores from turnover. They were top 6 in scores from front half. The only stat that they didn't rank top 6 in was their ability to score from the back half, which is baffling, but I do have a bit of a reason for that. But yeah, it's just bewildering to me that when I look at these numbers, that I just don't understand how a team can have, like, if you go back last year, Collingwood had a worse statistical profile than what the Dogs did this year, and Collingwood premiers, and the Dogs this year don't even win a final. So I don't know what's going on at that football club. It's been the same now for years. But I guess the one thing in finals is that you are who you are going into finals. And I think Hawthorn identified this, that if they could win the stoppage battle against the Bulldogs, the clearance battle, and play the game in their front half, I think they knew that the Dogs weren't particularly strong at scoring from the back half. And then you actually look at that game, and I think the Dogs scored like 3 goals from the back half or something. They only scored 5 goals from turnover. If I just quickly get up the thing now, I don't think it would have been many from the back half. Just bear with me a sec. But yeah, it is absolutely baffling as to how the Dogs weren't able to win a final, because I said when we did our finals preview, I said they can win the flag. There's no reason why they couldn't win the flag with that profile. They were red hot coming into that. They were red hot coming into that. They were the number 1 ranked team. They were number 1 defensively. They were number 1 at general play contested possessions. So the fact that they weren't able to even win that battle is bewildering. They got absolutely pantsed in the ground ball battle, which forms part of this which forms part of this post clearance stuff. But if you have a look at their back half, so they scored 1 goal from the back half, the Western Bulldogs, which in a final it probably is more relevant to play in the front half. Because generally the team that wins the inside 50 battle does win the match overall. And we saw that in the final series. I think only one matchup didn't have the eventual winner win the inside 50 battle. So I think Hawthorn identified this, was that if they can win contest and get the ball forward themselves, that the Dogs aren't a strong back half scoring team. And it came to roost. So it is still just baffling that when I went through and did this, how the Dogs were not able to, win a final, because I feel like they could have beaten Port Adelaide in Adelaide. That was definitely doable. They beat Sydney in Sydney a few weeks earlier. They absolutely pants them. They won that game by 10 goals. So there's no reason why they couldn't have gone up there and done that. And then they back in Melbourne for a home grand final against Brisbane, whose MCG record is questionable at best. Although I think their 2 best games in the last 2 years have been the 2 grand finals, and they have been on the MCG. So I think that's a little bit of a myth that Brisbane. I think you got to dig a little bit deeper than that. But yeah, it just baffles me that Luke Beveridge has got all this talent on the list. He's got probably the second best, or maybe the third best player in the league, in my opinion, in Bontempelli. He's got Norton. He's got Ugle-Hagan. He's got Waitman. He's got Treloar. He's got Libba. He's got, I know Bailey Smith didn't play, and we'll probably touch on him in a sec. He's got Riley West. He's got Bailey Dale. He's got, he's got Tim English, who's a great ruckman. He's got Liam Jones, who's one of the best fullbacks. He's got Roy Lobb, who reinvented himself, and yet they still can't win a final. So I don't know where to hear from the Dogs, because I don't think statistically they can actually be any better than what they were this year. So just for comparison, most sides with this profile are probably finishing top 4. And to be honest, they're probably finishing top 2. So the only profile that I saw across the last 2 years that actually somewhat matched this was Brisbane's last year, and they missed out on a premiership by 4 points. So that's sort of what you're talking about. So again, it is baffling that they were not able to win a final, and they didn't really look like winning that final either. That was the concerning part for me, was once the game was actually out of their grasp, they didn't even really try and do anything to get control back. It was just a landslide in the end. So, yeah, I don't know where to hear from the Dogs. I'm a bit lost on how the Dogs can actually improve next year, because I don't know how you can improve when you're top 6 in basically every single stat that I would consider to be important when it comes to premiership success, and then you don't win a final. So I don't know if you can help me out here, Thomas. I don't know if there's any Dog supporters out there as well who can maybe help us out, because I feel like that I'm just lost on the Dogs. I don't know what they are, because if you give any side that profile, they're probably making top 4. They're probably winning at least one final, if not 2. And they're probably, to be honest, they're probably playing off on grand final day, to be honest. So it is, I'll just say it is mind-boggling that they were not able to win a final with this profile. And yeah, I don't know where to from here, because I don't know how you can improve that. Help me out, Thomas. What are your thoughts? But I'm lost. I'm honestly lost.
We'll talk about the trade ins and outs in a minute, but I think my 2 cents worth is, and what I've always been critical of the Dogs, is they've got so much talent, as you reeled off, so many A-grade players, so many All-Australian capable players. But it just seems like Beveridge doesn't really know where to get the best out of his players. You look at that midfield mix, Bontempelli has to be in there 24/7. I don't think he deserves to play forward. Treloar is, All-Australian, no doubt about it. Richards was probably the one that they needed to be in there permanently from the start, the get-go. He's that defensive midfield player. Libra, I just don't think's up to it anymore with regards to age profile and injury history. Maybe they need to roll through more players, because as we all know, the best midfield groups obviously have multiple strings to their bow. It's not just 3 midfielders doing the job. The problem is, I don't think they utilise their best players to their best capabilities. You look at McRae's now requested trade out. He was one that probably should have played at times. He was better than what they threw in as their second-tier midfield group. There was Garcia getting thrown in there ahead of McRae. And then you look at issues elsewhere. They've got Ugle-Hagan, Norton as their forward, Darcy as well. That's a really strong forward line. They just could not get the best out of them at all. I think the problem there is their small forward brigade is not up to scratch. Cody Waitman's obviously their number 1 small forward. I think playing all of Norton, Darcy, and Ugle-Hagan's probably not the right way to go. It just seems like there's too many young players going all at once, the ball in that forward line. I just don't seem to see where that works out. They've got issues defensively speaking. They're probably missing key players in different parts of the ground other than the midfield, if that makes sense. So missing a good one-on-one small defender and a good one-on-one small key forward. I think there's problems there. And I think they just don't have their mix yet right set in stone. And a big issue of that is at times it just seems like Beveridge does not know where he wants to play his players. I think he's thrown too many magnets around that board this season, which has caused a bit of unrest in that 22. And I think they need a massive reset into next year and almost a fresh mindset, considering they've signed Beveridge on to where they're going to be next year. Because if they start pulling shit again where they're pulling Bontempelli and in half forward, you've got serious problems. But
so
yeah,
in Leighton's terms, Thomas says sack Beveridge.
yeah, I would not. I don't know why they signed him on. As a St Kilda supporter, it's not like I want him to get sacked, but I just don't understand why he was there in the back end of this year. As much as they made a final, I don't think he was the one, and I think they need a fresh voice. But moving on to the trade in and outs, this is a big one. Bailey Smith. This is going to be a massive talking point for the entire week. He's a linchpin in a lot of trade murmurs. Obviously wanted to request to Geelong. He's got a long-standing partnership with Cotton On. He's the brand sponsor, if you're not aware of the jumper for the Cats. So make of that what you will with what the Cats will do as a marketing team. But yeah, they seem to be at loggerheads with that trade. Just pulled up my phone a minute ago, and it seems like, I mean, trade radio is obviously a lot of rabble half the time, but they did mention there, I'm just trying to get the conversation up. Damien Barrett and Josh Jenkins, if you're not aware, are the two blokes that are on that trade radio majority of the time.
So that's the late trade.
Yeah, so they were saying that, St Kilda are silly to be, are there rumours that pick 7 and 8 might be used to snare Bailey Smith into Moorabbin? Josh Jenkins said, why not? Barrett basically said there's no way that they're going to do it. I don't think they will. I think that's too much for Smith when you've got 2 top 10 draft picks. However, questions have to be asked of whether Smith goes to another club or Geelong just can't get the deal done. I think a lot of the issues that I'm seeing at the moment with the trade period is just the teams that are needing those players. So I'm going to use Collingwood as an example. Needed to pull a lot of other trades to get the required trade required to get their player, which in this case is Houston. But Smith in the Dogs case just can't get a deal done to Geelong. There's rumours going on that they'll walk him to the national draft, which is a whole nother kettle of fish where that goes in. So definitely interesting one, and interesting to hear your thoughts, Nathan. Jack McRae requested to go to St Kilda. He's one that the Saints are obviously interested in. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of loggerhead jams with where that trade will go, whether it's a pick 43 or a pick 27. The Dogs obviously want a second round pick for him or a future whatever. But Saints obviously really steadfast in that. I believe that will probably get done probably late. Caleb Daniel, rumours are he might go to North. I've been interested to hear thoughts on that. I think Daniel's one that whichever club takes him, probably you're going to find his best form again. I do believe he was played all over the wrong position at the Dogs. No idea why he was played in some positions where Beveridge put him, but I think he's truly a half-backman, playing off that half-back line, utilising his kicking skills. He's got brilliant foot skills. Xavier Halloran is only the real name that I've noticed the Dogs put any interest in. I think they're trying to really improve their draft hand, if anything, by offsetting some of those players who weren't really in the best 22 to start with. But you look back to my argument in the first place, Smith and McRae should really be playing centre bounces at the Dogs. They got that speed. McRae's got that talent with his foot skills. What are your thoughts in particular? We'll leave Daniel and O'Halloran to another day, I think, with the relevance of this all. But McRae and Smith are two that are really important, I think, in this trade period.
Yeah, well, I'll start off with McRae, and I feel like St Kilda will win in the end. I don't know. I think he's still contracted, but I don't know how you could possibly keep someone who you're not actually playing. So I feel like that McRae, he probably can't walk because he's still contracted.
Yeah.
But I feel like it could be I don't know if he go down the path of who was the St Kilda player that went to Freo and basically said I'm not playing at GWS. I've forgotten his name, the curly hair guy.
Yeah.
I've forgotten his name.
Blake Acres?
No, not Acres. He was from the GWS. He went to Freo. He didn't play. He was in contract. He didn't play a whole year at Freo. He doesn't play anymore. But he basically. Pardon?
Chris Mayne?
No, not Chris Mayne. No, it wasn't a household name. He was a forward. He was a key forward, I think. He had curly hair. I can picture him. Yeah, anyway, I can picture him. I just can't remember his name. It might come to me later on. But I don't know if he go down that path of basically say, well, I'm contracted, but I'm not playing. And then essentially the Dogs are paying him to sit around. I don't know if that's in their best interest. So I feel like that deal will get done. I don't know if Saints just part with their future second pick and just either say take it or leave it. Bailey Smith, yeah, this is an interesting one. So I don't know who Bailey Smith is. So last year they flagged this because he didn't actually play this year. So I guess there are no stats to go off. But I know last year there was this show called Pure Footy, and it was David King and Daniel Hoyne, and they basically posed the question, who is Bailey Smith? Because you look at him, he's not a centre bounce player. So he was at one stage, I think it was about round 4 or 5. He was ranked 145th as the 145th for impact at stoppage. So then you say, well, he's probably not a stoppage player, but then he's ranked 126 as the same player as a transition mid. So who is he? Like, is he a centre bounce player that can go forward? Is he a transition midfielder, or is he just a so-called, a nice have, if you will, who just looks good and plays good, flashy and good, but doesn't really do anything? So I don't know if you can have those types of players. I feel like I'm a little bit conflicted with this because I feel like pick 17 is quite reasonable for him, given the fact that he's out of contract, he's coming off an ACL, and his last, his last couple of years haven't been that great statistically anyway. So I feel like that in the end, I think Geelong are going to stick firm with pick 17, and I think that's probably fair enough. I think that's probably all he's worth right now. If he was in contract, it might be a different issue. But basically, if the Dogs don't accept pick 17, he's not going back there next year. So if they're happy just to let him walk, well, good on them. I'd say well done for sticking up for what you believe in. If you want a top 10 pick and your other club's not willing to match that and you let him walk, I think that's making a stand. But then I think at the same time, I think Geelong are also making a stand by saying, well, we've valued him at this pick 17. And if you don't take that, we'll take him in the draft. I guess the only issue of going to the draft is that you basically be, you can basically go anywhere that you want, basically. I don't think he can use this, I don't want to go interstate thing anymore. I don't think that's going to hold up anymore, given he's been in the system now for a little while. So, and I don't think Geelong are going to pay overs for him like what Collingwood did at Luke Ball, or like what Jack Munn, or like what Carlton did at Jack Munn, where they heavily front-end his contract. I don't think that's what they're going to do. So I feel like if he goes to the draft, it is going to be that risk of what if an interstate club picks him up. But I still think even if he goes through the draft, I still think he will eventually get his way to Geelong. I guess for the Dogs, if they don't get anything for him and he ends up being, a star player at Geelong and they got nothing for him, and then they sort of have a few down years, they might blow up in their faces that they didn't just take what Geelong offered them. So definitely glad that both clubs seem to be holding firm. I think one of the clubs will break. I don't know who it will be. I feel like it will be the Dogs just because he's out of contract. But yes, I think this is going to be the one that potentially goes right down to the wire or doesn't get done. Just because of what both clubs are actually asking for. So I think the Dogs are going to blink. I think he'll go there for 17 and maybe a future first, which might end up being around the same point anyway. But yeah, I think time will tell on that. And as for Daniel, just really quickly with Daniel, I do agree with you. I think he will be a star at whatever club he goes to. Just play him off the half-back line where he played his best football. You just say, we're going to settle you here. We're going to give the ball to you. You're going to be our main player coming out of the back line. And I feel like the team that gets him, if it is North Melbourne, that'll be a massive win for them, given that their back half scoring is the third worst in the AFL, and they've scored the third fewest points from the back half, and they've given up the most points from their own back half, from their own, their own back half turnovers.
Yeah.
So, I feel like that if Daniel goes there, that will be a massive, massive win for North Melbourne.
Yeah, no, I think. Look, I mean, the Dogs have a lot of running halfbacks, and Dale's their main distributor off halfback. I think Daniel's been squeezed out of that kind of conversation. But yeah, Smith is an interesting one altogether. I think that'll get done as late as physically possible, if not missing out altogether and walking to that draft. That's another conversation for another day. But yeah, as I said, I think this whole conversation just links back to the fact that, Beveridge just doesn't know where to play these players. I think that's what it comes down to. He probably has just too many players of similar ilk and just missing out on specific players with specific needs that need to be filled in that Dogs best 22. But yeah, definitely one to look for 2025. But yeah, before we wrap it up, I know we've gone just over the hour mark, so we'll keep this one short. Player focus for next year, I think, is Ed Richards. Especially if the likes of McRae and Bailey Smith are traded off, and as they most likely will be, that leaves a void with regards to the amount of depth they suddenly have. So you look at their list this year, they had Bontempelli, Treloar, Libba, Richards as their main four. Then they had McRae, Smith, obviously injured, but if he's fit, he plays midfield. Garcia played in there. That's pretty much about it off the top of my head. But yeah, all of a sudden, 2 of their 6 rotation mids are now gone. Richards basically was there transitioning from defense into the midfield when Libba had that whole concussion issue and just looked at home, really. Played extremely well when it was up against the wall in those contested games, the likes against Sydney, GWS, all those heavy contested games where you're coming up against the best opposition mids. He shined. Dominated against Richmond, 163 SuperCoach points, his most, first-rate mids. Feasted on the Richmond Tigers this year. Round 9, that was 34 disposals, 10 tackles, 12 inside 50s. Having said that, he probably had some down games where he just wasn't quite at it. He has some soft tissue injury risks as well, and he plays that kind of kamikaze style, which opens him up to concussions and things like that. What are your thoughts on Ed Richards? Can he become an uber premium in 2025? Or do you reckon there is just so much doubt around the Bulldogs mix that you just don't touch Beverages as midfielders in 2025?
I'll be very quick here. Here's a pass for me. I can't trust any Bulldogs player other than Bond because I know what I'm going to get. I don't know where Ed Richards is going to play from week to week. One week he might start off in the centre bounce and score 163 like he did against Richmond. And then the next week he might start as a half-forward flanker and give you 50. So I just basically put all the Dogs in the basket where unless they're Bond, Tim English just chucked them out or they're a rookie. Chuck them out because you don't know where they're going to play. You don't know if they're going to play. And then if they do play, you don't know what position they're going to play. So he's a pass for me, unless he's a defender eligible, which I doubt he will be. But I feel like he's probably more of a draft player in that case. But yeah, for Classic, he's a pass for me. Just because I can't trust Beveridge and and where he plays. That's
100%. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of question marks with Dogs players in particular, bar the bona fide players that are playing in certain roles. Bontempelli and Treloar really being the only two. Even as an owner of Dale, it was definitely frustrating when he was even thrown at half forward when he was quiet and tagged out of it. So question marks have to be raised next year if they don't get the best out of him. I think Nathan's spot on. Baffled as why they didn't win a final this year, and even moving into 2025, if they don't win a final next year with the same list they have this year, then serious questions have to be asked about Beveridge, and I think it's time that he departs the fold for the Doggies. But that's all we got time for today. I know it's a bit of a longer episode with the 3 teams. Next week, you've got the expansion club pack looking forward to with the Suns and the Giants. Definitely some interesting conversation to be had around there. One with the Gold Coast Suns, with where they're at as a club, really. Do you reckon that they hold up in potentially making finals at all, really, with the amount of money AFL's pumped into them? And the Giants have been so many times where they've been so close, humiliated on the bigger stage, Can they rebound one more time in 2025 and moving forward more positively with Kingsley and how he's turned that club around? That's definitely an interesting conversation to have for sure. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your week and the kind of trades that eventuate from this. As you know, the trade period will end this week. So by next week, we'll have the finalised kind of trade ins and out for the remainder of the teams. There's no more speculation. And have a good one, and we'll catch you for the next one.